Hello, my name is Andrew Doherty. I'm from Cheek Point and I've been asked to do a reading for Active Retirement Week, and this is what I've put together. One aspect of growing up in a rural fishing village like Cheek Point in the 1970s was that I was often in the company of the elder fishermen who patiently passed along so much of the knowledge I now possess about the river, the tides, and the fishing. In autumn back then, the fishermen hauled out the timber fishing punts that were turned over and allowed to dry out after a season of fishing salmon or eel. Many used the green in Cheek Point, but we preferred the small patch of grass at Moran's Poles on Ryan's shore that runs between Passage and Cheek Point. There the men would gather to scrape the barnacles and the moss, wash the hull and make small repairs. But they also gathered to chat, smoke their cigarettes to while away the time over the long winter months. In their company, stories of the village, the fishing, seafaring, and the harbour were shared with enthusiasm. Of course, they also did a fair bit of blackguarding, and the tall stories were legion. Skills were passed on like net mending, rope splicing, and basic woodwork, although some skills were less attractive to my parents. One Sunday, for example, I returned home from the Strand and I asked my father if I could light his cigarette. He was sitting at the fire and he nearly choked on his cup of tea. Anyway, I persisted and he said, "Go on, so." So I took the cigarette in my mouth, I struck the match on the box and I cupped my hand around the flame. Bending down, I puffed hard and came up with the cigarette lit to perfection. Amazed, he asked me, "Where did you learn that?" And I replied, beaming with pride, "Paddy Doherty just showed me. He said that any man that fishes needs to know how to light a fag when he's out in a gale." "Well, you're on your way, so," said my father, as he snatched the cigarette out of my fingers. Before I ever went to fish, I would know that the salmon don't swim in easterly wind, and men that fished in those conditions were wasting their time. Or that when the water was clear, you needed to fish close to the shoreline, or a northeast wind you could get a handy drift at the holly bush. When I eventually went to fish, it was a surprise to find that these men who chatted so freely on shore clammed up and became reclusive when on the river. Idle chatter, the yarns and the laughter were saved for downtime. Once the nets were in the water, they watched with the patience of a herring gull on the shore. They dismissed all but the most pertinent questions and gave orders with abrupt commands. It would take me many years to understand why, but these men of the river were watching the signs. The river spoke, you see. They just needed to pay attention. Listening to the river kept you out of harm. It prolonged the drifts and it increased your chances of a catch. And these men measured their fishing and each other by such terms. Perhaps the most obvious lesson to me in the value of the older men was my first trip to repair a fishing weir off Cheek Point. The weirs date at least to the coming of the Cistercians at Dunbrody Abbey in 1200. Two lines of poles, each about the size of a telegraph pole, are driven by hand into the riverbed, and the lines form a V. At the narrow end, a net is hung which fishes with the tide. The weirs needed regular repairs, and the driving of new poles is a tough physical job. When I first went in the company of the adults to repair a weir, I was surprised to see my granduncle, Paddy Moran, sitting on the gunwale of a half-decker. As the men set to the task of raising the pole from the river to stand it upright prior to starting to drive it, the strain and the physical exertion was obvious. Muscles were taut, faces were red, grunts and groans emitted from everywhere. Once the pole was stood, it was discussed and debated as to the position. Is it straight? Is it in too far? Is it out too far? And as the discussion went on, it seemed to my young and eager mind to be a bit needless. Turning to Paddy, the younger men sought his opinion. As the oldest man on the crew, I suddenly realised that his role was not a physical one. He was the guide, the arbiter. He had been to more of these events than I could ever imagine, and his word carried a weight that I could only hope in time to match. a wisdom born of hard physical labour, of mistakes, of successes, and of paying close attention to the language of the river. It was only later, through experience, that I learned that a mistake in the driving of a pole could cause the weir to lose its fishing prowess. The efficiency depended on the correct alignment of the poles, and a mistake in this could cause families to lose their livelihoods. Of course, as a young man, I was keen to set out on my own, do it my own way, and make my own mistakes. But the lessons of my elders sitting beside the shore those many years ago are still with me now. It's part of what I pass on through my own regular maritime blogs. Thank you.